coming out tonight. This is our last reading of the fall 2014 semester. It's been great, and if you want any information about our upcoming events, you should go on the college website and just type connections in the search bar, and you'll see we have a whole schedule of programs, literary programs for the spring 2015. This is a great reading every semester because it focuses on the works not of visiting authors, but of people from the CSM community. So this is your night to be celebrated. I want to thank everybody who contributed, everybody whose work we're going to be featuring this evening. It's always very encouraging to see all the submissions that come in every semester, so please continue to tell your friends and family and people you know who are interested in photography or poetry or short stories, even essays, personal essays, memoirs, and things like that. We've published chapters of memoir in the past. Continue to submit, continue to support the programs. We love this last one again because it's a local community event, and the format is very it's very casual. It's nothing formal. So those of you who are going to be coming up to read, it's up to you. You can either just open up and read from your piece, or you can tell us what inspired you, what it's about, sort of the background. Totally up to you.
So I'm not on the card, but my name is Kelsey Ayana, and I wrote the poem The Lobsterman. And it is written about my father. He's been a lobsterman for the past 30 years of his life up in Maine, and he got his college degree in computer science and just decided, he wanted to do what he loved. He wanted to stay in Maine. He wanted to be a lobsterman. And so that's what he decided to do, and he's never really looked back on it. But I think at 57, he's kind of feeling some of the effects and some of the tolls that it's taken on his body and stuff from that type of work. And so this poem is kind of about that. And one of the stories he always tells me is that in Maine back in the older days, you could always tell the poor people because those were the kids who came to lunch with the lobster sandwiches. And I think it's kind of ironic because it's not thought of a poor person's food by any means anymore. So that's just a little bit of a backstory on this poem, and it's called The Lobsterman, so I'll just go ahead and read it. He whose hands have worked and body aches from the constant labor that has painted his life, his skin shaded the color of the sun, his palms calloused by the ropes that are his lifeline. The hum of the motor deafening the sound of the sea along with his ears. The salted hull of his body a spectacle, strong and weathered, hauling the traps that once fed the poor and now only the privileged. He who can barely stay afloat with the changing of tides. He who is, he who always will be, a lobsterman.
Hi, my name is Randy Bridgeman, and I'm going to read this poem. It's actually a poem. It's in the prose section, but it's a poem. And it's called Washington State, 1961. It's where I grew up, about 5 miles from the Canadian border. It's about 38 miles to town from there. And it was right up against the Cascades. The great thing about it was I didn't have to go to school about half the winter because the bus couldn't get out there, so that was great. But it had a really spiritual impact on me, being alone and trout fishing and hunting and living up in the Pacific Northwest. It's called Washington State, 1961. The Pacific Northwest was always gray, mossy rock, slippery, weighted down, soggy. Like a wet blanket on a fire, the clouds smoky and as low as the treetops pushing down on the senses, the heaviness I breathed in, a chill bone deep. In that place, tucked away in the Cascades where the clouds knocked up against the Skagit River Valley walls until they drained themselves on everything. This is what I remember. Everything washed, born again, clean, baptized over and over as if the whole world had lost its salvation. The Skagit River, its whirlpooling waters as deep as steelhead swim. The valley was glacier-made, its evergreens filtering sunlight in the peaks, waterfalls appearing from rocks as if Moses had struck them with his stick, girder bridges crossing water as natural as fallen trees across streams, those unexpected opportunities for crossing over. This was my catechism. This is where my story begins. There, where the world was written under the rocks in the bottom of those trout streams, there was something there in the comings and goings of the wind, bending the Douglas firs silver side up, flashing in the woods like thoughts through the unkept lots of my young mind. The whisper of the field grass as it parted to let me through, like I was a stranger, a sojourner, who stumbled upon a gathering, a congregation, some ritual maybe, the distinct sounds of these streams of conscious, like vocal cords vibrating water over rock, the ancient voice of these cascades broken upon this valley, and I have stopped to let God in without religion getting in the way. Thank you.
Good evening. So my photograph is on page 36, and it's the thinker, self-portrait. So I took this photograph 10 years ago when I was turning 40, and I'd always heard that when you were turning 40, at least when I was a kid, when you were turning 40, it was kind of a momentous occasion. And so when that time came, I kind of made sure that it was for me, whether it was or not, but I made sure when I turned 40 that I was going to honor that day. So, so on that day, I decided to spend pretty much the entire day on the third floor of my house, and kind of reflect back on the first 40 years of my life, and see where I'd been, and then decided to also look a little further into the future. I figured that 40 was a halfway point. If I had another 40 years left, what was going to be of that 40 years? And so I wanted to kind of come out with something that would embody that particular day for me. So I decided to do some photographs, and two of my favorite sculptures are, one is the French Rodin's Thinker, and the other is a German Reinhold, Hugo Reinhold, and his sculpture is, the English term is ape with skull. And so I took the two, combined them, and the one kind of, the Rodin's Thinker, for me, kind of looks at introspection, looking back, looking at your past, reflecting, and with Reinhold's ape with skull, kind of looks at, when he's looking at if you're familiar with the sculpture, it's actually the chimpanzee with the skull sitting on books, and one of the books is of Darwin, and it's looking at mortality. So I kind of just combined the two and spent the day fooling around with that, and that's what I came up with. So, thanks.
How's everyone doing? My name is John Karis, and the picture's on page 20. Me and my wife went up towards Rocky Gap, towards Frostburg, and you got Pennsylvania line and West Virginia line. She didn't know that. And she loves taking pictures. Now I'm for the ride. So we're riding up and down Pennsylvania line and everything, and she said, look at that little shack over there. I said, that thing's built to last. They don't make them like that no more. And I took it with those cheap phones that we got. That's where it came from. And she loved it. She put it in. She said, your picture got accepted. I said, no, that's your picture. But she loves this class, and I think everybody's contribute to it and everything, and that's how the picture came. Thanks.
Good evening. I'm Mitzi Phalen. My poem is found on page 18. This poem is a little bit of background. The poem stemmed from a discussion I had with one of my colleagues at work one day last summer. We were talking about a project we were working on, and I had sent a request for information to the program office and had gotten nothing in response. And so I told him I got nothing but crickets. And, that there's nothing there, right? And emptiness punctuated only by the sound of a cricket. He hadn't heard that phrase before, and he found it interesting. And he thought about it, and he said, that would be a great title for a blues song. And I said, yeah. So a few days later, I was falling asleep, lying in bed, listening to the crickets chirping outside the window, and I thought, if I were going to write a poem based on nothing but crickets, what would that poem sound like? And so it started to take form in my head, and this is not a blues song, but this is what resulted from my thinking about that line. So page 18, nothing but crickets. Emptiness, cavernous like a dark night, heavy and thick. Nothing but crickets. I cry out, a call for help. Will you answer? Only more crickets. Comfort me with bird song. Cue the full-throated thrush. Give me sound soothing. I do not want crickets. Then, as though imperceptibly, a stirring, a voice, distant, small, still, amplified by crickets. A slight breeze, gentle, exploring the emptiness, diluting the darkness, guided by the crickets. An invitation, I knock. A door opens, backlit, calming the crickets. You meet me on the road. You talk as we walk together. Yet, I do not recognize you. My mind is on the crickets. Breaking bread, you feed me. I know you now. Your light has reached me. Using nothing but crickets.
I wrote the short story Troll. It's on page 45. I didn't base it on any real event or any real person, but sort of using my real experiences to shape what I felt someone like this would probably do. Mopeds ain't real rock. They suck gas and you're a faggot if you think otherwise. The 15-year-old leaned back, hands resting on the back of her head. Her work was done. Now all she had to do was wait for the wave of flame to come through, and satisfaction would be hers. She hit the refresh button on her browser. 13 hours earlier, Benny Lorizzo leaned back and admired his work. A 4-minute video concisely reviewing a newly released album by The Color Gray, titled Shape and Form, starring, written, filmed, and edited by himself. The 4th video on his YouTube channel, MediaBot, still only 2 weeks old. All that and he still had time to do his Spanish and algebra homework over the weekend. The very next thought made his heart sink. Tomorrow was Monday, the start of another week as a freshman at Blue Jasmine High School. He brushed his teeth in silence, checked his homework one more time, and went to sleep. On the internet, surely he was a rising star. His fan base, such as it was, being a grand total of 5 people, liked what he was doing so far and were already sending in requests. Hence his review of Shape and Form, by a band he'd never even heard of until 2 days ago. And it wasn't hard to see how he could go far with his channel. In a realm where mere amateurs clumsily gave their opinions on the latest entertainment trends, Benny delivered four honest and, again, concise reviews with confidence, intelligence, and humor. In the real world, Benny only had the second attribute. He was about as big as a mouse with dark brown hair and was equally mousy. Almond-shaped hazel eyes and a light sprinkling of freckles on his rounded face, which, combined with a shorter-than-average height and meager frame, made him look 3 years too young to be a freshman. Each time he left the house, whatever charisma he even thought he might have had evaporated. Benny had no friends, no one went out of their way to talk to him during lunch, and the only time it seemed anyone took notice of him was when he did something embarrassing. Case in point, last Wednesday everyone saw him trip over some senior punk's expertly timed leg stretch as he boarded the bus home. Nobody laughed. He, Paul Madison, really was a punk, just a few tattoos and one brow piercing short of forming his own band. But a few students flew the word out with their mouths. When Benny's alarm went off, as usual, he decided to suck it up and try to survive another day. It started with a bowl of Cheerios. Was there a less original breakfast than that? Maybe. But someone, probably his dad, had finished off the last box of Jimmy Dean's in the freezer, so his options narrowed exclusively to the most iconic, tasteless cereal in the nation. Already, this was going to be a fun day. Things picked up a little after his shower, though. He checked his messages and discovered that someone under the username I'm Out of Style not only subscribed to his own channel, but also made also made a request right there in the comment section of his recent video. Looking good with these videos so far. Thinking to do a review of Plastic Sleeves by the Mopeds? They like my favorite rock band, K thanks. Benny thought about it on his way to the bus stop. He'd heard of the Mopeds, but the album in question wasn't out yet. But in a few days' time, it would be. If you could make a video on that day, he would be one of the first to talk about it, making it more likely that people looking it up on YouTube would find him. He smiled. This was a sure thing. No sooner had he arrived on the bus stop did he hear the roar of the bus's engine as it pulled up to let him and 3 other students on. Benny took a seat in the very front row. 5th period was when Benny had lunch this school year. Today, though, he got permission to visit the counselor's office. In theory, this is more important than overcooked spaghetti and a carton of milk, but he still had time to eat it first. The counselor, Mr. Bradson, had just stored a folder in one of his desk drawers when Benny came in. There was the second time they'd seen each other, but Bradson recognized him right away, not that he shouldn't have. Benny, right? Asked Bradson. You were in here last Thursday, weren't you? Yeah, said Benny after a short pause. Bradson pushed his glasses up to the tip of his nose. I'll get right to it, he said. This is about the Madison kid, Paul, the one you said tripped you on the bus? Uh-huh. I had a word with him. Benny sat up. Already, this was more than anyone at Greggsfield Middle School had done for him. And he says he didn't do it. Benny sighed. Of course he didn't, he said. Of course he said he didn't. Bradson looked down at a sheet of paper on his desk before replying. Well, he said, what he actually said was, and I'm quoting him here, I'm sure to remember if I tripped someone with his face. He paused. Then he clarified by saying there's nothing wrong with your face, but the point is he says he didn't do anything wrong. Then he's lying. Bradson sighed. I believe you, he said, but I can't just take your word for it. Why not? It's rude to interrupt other people. Sorry. But to answer your question, suppose Paul told me you tried to get even with him by putting jalapenos in his mashed potatoes. Benny sat up again. But I didn't, he said. Exactly, said Bradson. Now you see why I can't just take your word for it, even if I believe you? He paused. Now, because I believe you, I could go talk to some of his friends, see if they say anything. Or probably a few students to ride your bus. Benny stood up. No thanks, he said. Are you sure? Asked Bradson. I'm trying to help you, Benny, but I can't help you unless you let... But Benny had already walked out the door. Mr. Bradson sighed again and wrote himself a note on a post-it to email Benny's parents about this meeting. Benny didn't really notice that Paul Madison was actually standing by where he usually sat at lunch, and wouldn't have if he didn't speak up. Hey, Benny. He didn't know if he was surprised or actually scared that he was there. Either way, he recorded seeing him. What? He asked nervously, with somehow a little bit of anger over the bus incident. Paul sat down. That counselor, Mr. Bradson, said you told him I accidentally tripped you on the bus last Wednesday? An accident? If you just went to see him, he continued, he probably told you I said I didn't do anything. What I meant was I didn't mean to do anything. An accident? I was just stretching my legs. Oh, said Benny. Sure you were, sure. No, said Paul. No, really. I didn't realize what I did until my friend Jackie told me about it. He was all, man, that was so uncalled for, so I wanted to come by and say I'm sorry. You are not, Benny exploded. And were it not for the overpowering student chatter, everyone in the cafeteria would have heard it. No, really, don't even lie to me, said Benny, because you're not the only person that's out to get me every day. You're not. You're not anything positive. Sorry, least of all. Paul frowned. I'm just trying to apologize. I get it. You're busy. And not just schoolwork either. I saw you. You know what? Said Benny. I don't care what you saw. Paul stood up. You know what? He said. Nobody cares about your opinion. The bell rang. End of 5th period. Barely 2 seconds later, Paul was lost in the crowd of students, gone with a barely audible motherfucker. It only got worse. 6th period was biology, but this was the only thing that mattered for today. After Benny sat down and put his notebook on his desk, another student walked by, flipping it off the desk and onto the floor. Sorry, he said, with definite sarcasm this time. 7th period was Spanish, and that wasn't nearly as bad. Everyone else in that class was at least a little friendly. But 8th period, psychology, was the worst. Nobody paid attention during that class except Benny, and even he was distracted sometimes by the antics of the other students, which the aging teacher, Mr. Faradine, was either indifferent to or, given that he didn't hear very well out of his left ear, possibly unaware of. When the bell finally rang to mark the end of class, Benny was the first out the door, but still not fast enough to avoid the impact of a paper airplane. Benny turned around to pick it up. He knew he wasn't going to like what was folded up inside, but he unfolded it anyway. He was right. It was a drawing of him, but an absolute caricature of his mouse-like features, which is to say, he was depicted as a literal mouse. He barely looked at the number on his bust to make sure it was the correct one. He even knows that the only available seat happened to be the one right in front of Paul Madison. He didn't even hear a word anyone said to him, because all he could think about was Benny the Rat. Finally, he was home. Sanctuary at last. He had done it. A written note greeted him on the refrigerator. Benny, Dad and I are out for Mrs. Ford's retirement party. Won't be back until 8 or so. We left you $25 to order a pizza. Whatever's left over is your allowance for this week. Love you, Mom. That almost made his day worthwhile. Almost. Because upon checking his messages on YouTube, Benny found out that someone had replied to the person requested to review the Mopeds album. According to a timestamp, it was sent just a few minutes after the school day ended. It ran as such. Mopeds ain't real rock. They suck ass and you're a faggot if you think otherwise. It wasn't even addressed to Benny, but the effect it had was undeniable. Not even 15 seconds later, by which time he'd read it twice more, his eyes were starting to tear up. Who am I kidding, he thought to himself. I'm not gonna go anywhere in life. Then the worst thought of all, Paul was right. Nobody cares about my opinions. It didn't take long for Benny to find the bottle of Tylenol. It was open in his hand now. It still looked like it was almost full. He wondered how many it would take to cause death. He looked into it like he was looking down the barrel of the world's smallest gun. Long enough to start thinking about what he was actually doing. Would this actually solve anything? No, not really. There would still be a bunch of mean people in the world, and they would still be messing with other people's lives. The only difference is I wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. But the thing is, I wouldn't be able to do anything else either. He screwed the cap back on, set it down, and went straight to his room before he could change his mind. It was there, after he closed the door, that he noticed he was holding onto a piece of paper. He didn't remember picking up one earlier, except it was the drawing of Benny the Rat, immortalized in ink. But there was more on the back, partially bleeding through the front. Benny turned it over and saw this message. Drew this during lunch. If you're not too busy, could we maybe hang out after school sometime? I could use some help studying for my midterms, and seems like you could use a friend. My bro just got a driver's license. Also, sorry about the airplane, but we kind of sit on opposite sides of the room. Mark Allen's. He turned the paper over again. The drawing didn't seem to bother him as much anymore. Actually, now that he could really look at it up close, Benny the Rat looked kind of cool. Benny had more algebra and Spanish homework in addition to a section of his biology textbook to read, all due tomorrow, and an English essay due in 2 weeks, but somehow this seemed more important. He'd bought plastic sleeves, the Mopeds album, from iTunes and was sitting on his computer for about 15 minutes now. That, however, was not his priority either. He carefully read over a 2-page script for a different video on a different topic altogether. It wasn't just what it definitely wasn't what his 6 fans knew him for, but maybe that just meant he had to branch out. His camera was still sitting on a tripod, in the same position as it was when he recorded his last video. Benny Lorizzo hit the record button and sat down in front of it. As always, he would edit those first few seconds out. It wouldn't be so easy to remember his moment of depression, but maybe that just meant his life was worth living by and by. He took a deep breath and smiled. Hi, he said, looking directly into the camera. I'm doing something different today. Today, I'm going to talk about internet trolls.
The photograph is on the cover. I have quite a few photographs of street musicians from Washington, Baltimore, and New York. I enjoy talking to them just as much as photographing them. They can be anywhere from close to homeless to professional musicians, to college professors. So it's one of my favorite themes when I'm out there with my camera. Thank you.
Funny story, I was going to college for St. Mary's College this past spring with my mom, and as we were driving home, I saw in the corner of my eye this row of mailboxes, and I thought, It would be a great picture because it's just at the natural depth of field. I wouldn't have to manipulate it with my camera or go into Photoshop later on. And so, happened to have my DSLR, turned around, we stopped, and that's how I got my photograph. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Beth Portner, and my story is The Decision on page 56. There's not really any major backstory behind this, but I've always been interested in the idea of a future that's not quite what we all think it is. So I guess here I go. The year is 2273. 100 years ago, physical contact was outlawed by the world eye, our government in the sky. They said it was for the good of the people. Research had shown touch to be a common factor in nearly every illness and evil of the world. The changes came slowly, and the people learned to accept them. My name is Nicoletta Dalka. I live with my mother and father in the 73rd housing zone of Upper West Inidred. From my room, I can see the misty peaks of the ancient mountains all the way to the broken-down clock tower. I was educated at the 70 Zone Education Center, a high-tech facility surrounded by extravagant fountains and sculptures. I was one of 3,500 students in the 445th Education Division. I was born at the Inidred Medical Facility on the 7th of August in the year 2250, making me 23 and 5 weeks old today. I am a good girl. I listen to my parents. I go to my education center every day, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I check into my social productivity station on time. The World Eye publicly recognized me and my education division as spectacular world citizens. I could have been a great political figurehead for them. However, 1 week ago, I met a rebel who believes the World Eye is corrupt. 1 week ago, my whole world began to change. I missed my train. I ran into the polished station, nearly slipping on the smooth marble floor, just in time to watch the blinking red lights on the rear of the train disappear into the dark of the tunnel. I sighed, closing my eyes and slowly turning around. I would have to wait 20 minutes for the next train, and it was my job to prepare dinner this evening. I'd walk home. I thought I knew the city fairly well. 5 minutes later, I realized I did not. The train provided me with an excellent view of certain landmarks, the large satellite dish which sits on the mountain, the old clock tower now filled with political offices, and the Inidred Medical Facility. These landmarks were all but invisible to me on the ground, obscured by buildings that scrape the sky. Many of these city buildings look the same, so one might imagine that would make it difficult for things to look unfamiliar. The buildings surrounding me, however, looked entirely unfamiliar. I attempted to double back and just wait for the train, but only managed to get myself more lost. I stood in the midst of the most dilapidated buildings I'd ever seen. The air smelled faintly of garbage and something more pungent that I couldn't quite place. I looked down the narrow alleys looking for any indication that they might lead to a more pleasant area. "You look lost, Poppet," a deep voice chuckled behind me. I turned to see a man, about my age, with incredibly pale skin and bright orange hair, dressed in the most ridiculous clothing I had ever seen. Tight black pants, a ruffled and billowy white shirt, under a deep blue coat with a top hat. I opened my mouth to speak, but couldn't quite find the words. He just laughed. "You got a name?" He spoke with an affected accent that made me cringe, as if he wanted to be viewed as unintelligent. I looked around, wondering why he was here in this awful part of the city. "Dalka, Nicoletta Dalka," I said, looking back at him. He carried himself differently than most other people I had met, as if he knew something no one else was allowed to know. It made me uncomfortable. He sauntered closer to me, and I took a few steps backward as he closed in on me. Sorry, I forget sometimes," he grinned, taking a step back and putting his hands out in front of him. "You forget?" I didn't understand what he meant, not at that point. I smiled politely at him before quickly turning around to find my way back to the train station. It was getting dark, and I was certain he was crazy. Wait, I can get you home. Walk with me," the man called out, his accent gone, taking a few steps and walking next to me. I moved to put several more inches between us. "I don't want to walk with you," I muttered quietly. I recognized the scent mixing with the garbage on this street. It was death. The only experience I'd ever had with death was in educational situations, but it turns out that no matter where it is, death smells the same. The more I looked around, the more animal carcasses I saw. I could feel my heart racing. I just wanted to be home. Just hear me out. I promise I won't hurt you. My name is Torin, he assured me softly. I think he could see the tears in my eyes. I took a deep breath. Get me home, I murmured. Get me home and you can talk about whatever you want on the way. Torin began to explain to me all the ways in which the world eye is corrupt. False records, unjustified executions, poor kept in cruel living conditions, and on and on. I decided to tune him out. Nothing he was saying seemed real. To me, he was speaking of some ridiculous other world. My education division had helped the poorest of the poor, and their conditions were not ideal, but certainly not cruel either. I had agreed that he could talk, but not that I would listen. I still wasn't quite comfortable with his presence, but I had a better chance of getting home with him. I hoped anyway. The sound of Torin clearing his throat roused me from thought. You think you're so smart. Fine, I get it. Don't listen, he scoffed and fell silent. I liked it better that way anyway. Still, I couldn't help the feeling of guilt that bubbled up inside me. Torin what? I asked, looking at him sideways. His introduction was much more casual than I was used to. I saw him flex his jaw and wondered what kind of a reaction that was. A name is just a name. My father was Cain Malloy, but I've abandoned that name. It's just Torin, he responded, eyes guarded and smile tight. I looked down, puzzled. Cain Malloy is a high-profile politician. What would his son be doing in such an awful part of town? And why would he not want to be associated with as important a person as his father? I looked up at him, and I think the question must have been written all over my face because he rubbed his head and continued. My mother was put to death because of him. It's something you wouldn't understand. The important thing to remember is that he is a selfish and cruel man who cares only for his career, he explained, speaking low as if worried someone else might hear. I looked around, but the street was empty, and no one was near who could hear him but me. His manner seemed to be getting more tentative as we neared the upper regions of the city. I've never seen a more gentle politician than Cain Malloy, Torin. I just find it hard to believe. I'm not sure what led me to say that to him. After I did, though, there was a stretched silence. I thought on everything he had told me as I watched the building I live in grow ever nearer. I had apologized several minutes ago, but it hadn't alleviated the heavy atmosphere. It bothered me that I had been acting so unkind. Listen, Torin, right? I asked, not quite sure I was saying his name properly. I don't know what you want from me. I'm not special, I asserted, facing him and giving him a what can you do look. It is one I have perfected. He laughed and shook his head, which took me by surprise. I felt my brow furrow. He glanced over at me and laughed again. Nicoletta, I interrupted, flashing a smile when he gave me a look. He just chuckled more. Fine, Nicoletta. You are special. Your face has been broadcast through the whole world as an example of perfection, he explained. I shook my head. That's an exaggeration. My face was not shown any more than any other face in my class, I argued as I felt myself blush. Torin exhaled loudly and looked ahead of us. I couldn't tell if he would speak again. We walked in silence until we stood at the doors to the building that was home. Well, thanks, I said awkwardly, avoiding Torin's eyes. I hoped that he would leave quickly and I could forget everything he said. Nicoletta, I know you're not interested. You took a wrong turn and lost yourself. I get that you weren't looking for a life change. But I don't believe in chance. We met each other for a reason, and I think you know that just as well as I do. Torin spoke quickly. There was no sign of the affected accent, and he couldn't seem to meet my eyes. It was not easy for him to admit his belief in fate. At the time, I didn't care, but the more I consider his words, the more I wonder why it was so difficult. I don't know any such thing, Torin, and I'm sorry, I really am, that your mother is dead. But maybe you should consider that she actually did put you in danger. At the time, what I said seemed reasonable, but I regret it now. The hurt I saw in Torin's eyes is something I hope to never see again. His voice was rougher the next time he spoke. Nicoletta, you don't know anything. Open your eyes. His words stuck with me. I couldn't shake them. Open your eyes. Over the next week, they echoed in my head. Because of that, I think, I did open my eyes. I saw things I never noticed. The cameras lining every street, watching every hallway in the buildings. The people who made themselves smaller, blending into the garbage of the alleys. I had always thought I was helping the poorest of the poor when I did community service with my education division. Yet the broken-down neighborhood I met Torin in was something I had never seen before, as if it was specifically ignored. I began to research. 95% of the population of the world got sick no more than 5 times a year. But was that because we are an exceptionally healthy people, or was the world eye controlling the percentages? I normally couldn't find an answer. That doesn't mean there isn't an answer, though, only that I am not allowed to know it. The more I examine the evidence, the more I recognize that there can only be one explanation for why I can't know such information. I don't want to admit that Torrin's cause is just. I don't want to admit that the world we live in is corrupt, and I don't want to admit that nothing I have been taught can be trusted. But I am a logical person, and none of it adds up. I was always taught that the government was good, is good. Somehow I never questioned it. I never had cause to before meeting Torrin. Now that I am questioning, though, I can see that something is not right. 1 week ago, I met Torrin. 1 week ago, Torrin told me things I did not want to know. And today, 1 week later, I am attempting to find him again, because I know what I can do and I know what needs to be done. The smell of death and refuse surrounds me, and as the sun sets in the windows of the buildings, they shimmer like fire. I see him leaning against a nearby wall. "Hello, Poppet, lost again?" I roll my eyes at his ridiculous accent. I walk closer to him, and he peeks at me from under the brim of the same top hat he wore a week ago. "Not quite," I respond. He grins, blue eyes smiling, and I wonder what he knows. I watch as he pushes off the wall and begins to walk away, motioning for me to follow. "Don't kid yourself, Poppet," he calls. "We're all lost."
Hello, I'm Patrick Allen. My poem is on page 40. It is The Bronze Buckaroo. I'll tell you a little bit about this poem. This poem is made up of a number of things. One of them is the obituary for Herbert Jeffries. I check the obituary every few days just to make sure I'm not there. And so I wanted to I keep track of those things because in obituaries there's often these interesting descriptions of the person's life and things like that. And this one really kind of just jumped off the page at me. I also was interested because I'm interested in this whole notion of how our memories work and what's lost, what's missing. And so this discussion about black cowboys was something that was on my mind as I've been reading a few books. And so using the obituary from Herb Jeffries, I also have the theme song from Happy Cowboy, which is the opening song for many of the cowboy movies that he made. And I also use some references to using movie forms that are to open and close scenes. So, this is the Bronze Buckaroo for Herb Jeffries. When I'm riding with my cattle, with my rope and my saddle, my horse and my gun, and I'm always on the run, I'm a happy cowboy. Herb Jeffries, a jazz balladeer whose matinee idol looks won him fame in the late 1930s as the Bronze Buckaroo, the first star of all black cowboy movies for segregated audiences, died May 25th in a hospital in West Hills, California. 1, slow fade to white. Bob Blake, resplendent in a white 10-gallon Stetson hat, a white neckerchief tied over a black Western shirt with mother-of-pearl buttons, double ivory-handled pistols on a 2-gun rig with shining silver buckles and turquoise ornamentation, hanging low around his waist, rides up on a snow-white charger. In the loud darkness, black faces stare in wonder at his grace and beauty. Check out his cool stride as he saddles up to the bar, spins 180 degrees so that his back is to the mirror, leans his elbows on the ledge, surveys the room coolly, and orders, "Barkeep, whiskey." "You new around here, partner?" the barkeep asks while spitting into and polishing a whiskey glass on his filthy apron. "Just riding through," Bob drawls, nonchalant and easy-like, "looking for a friend. He's got a ranch 6 miles from town. His name is Joe Jackson. The bartender sputters. Say, you don't want to go out there. There's trouble brewing. Bob says, I think I'll mosey out there just the same. Circle whites to black. The audience murmurs, uh-oh, old Bob is in for it now, in for trouble now. He said the idea of an all-black cowboy picture came to him while touring the South as a singer in the mid-1930s and visiting the tin roof movie theaters meant for black audiences. 2. Sing of the Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry, who preserved the peace of the Western Territories. Of Nat Love, also known as Deadwood Dick, who drove cattle from Texas to Kansas. Remember Cherokee Bill, who at his hanging said, I came here to die, not make a speech. And Rufus Buck, who after killing Deputy John Barrett, terrorized the Oklahoma along with his gang. And that old cattle thief and trickster Ben Hodges, buried on Boot Hill so that they can keep an eye on him. Tell the story of that two-fisted drinker, Stagecoach Mary, delivering the mail, her shotgun ever at the ready. And Bill Pickett, the champion of bulldogging and rodeo. Honor the 10,000 black cowboys riding all of the Goodnight, Loving, and Chisholm trails of the West. Mr. Jeffries learned to ride on his grandfather's dairy farm in Port Huron, Michigan, and he had grown up loving the cowboy films of Tom Mix and Buck Jones. 3. Slow fade to white. The peanut gallery shouts, Bob, look out behind you. Bob seems unaware and is about to be bludgeoned unconscious. Then, his Stetson never leaving his head, he drops to one knee, whirls, and shoots the club from Dirty Dan's hands. He jumps up in a swift balletic move and has a drop on him. Where's Joe, Bob demands. Standing there stupefied, holding his still stinging hand, Dan starts to say, I don't know. But Bob puts the barrel of a silver .38 under Dan's nose and cocks the hammer. I ain't gonna be asking again, where's Joe? Dirty Dan's eyes bug out to the size of a nickel peppermint sucker. They got him out at the mine shack. They're holding him for ransom. Don't shoot, don't shoot. Circle whites to black. The entire Saturday afternoon crowd lets out a loud guffaw. Old Dan knew better than to mess with Bob once he gets serious and start pointing them 6-shooters. At first, he said, Mr. Buell was hesitant to cast Mr. Jeffries because of his light skin. I asked him what he wanted. What do you want, someone who can ride and sing and act, or a color? I challenged him. Darken me up if you want to, and I will keep my hat on tight so no one can see my hair. 4. Stifling hot summer nights on the stoop in front of Jesse and little Ronnie's house, little black boys regale each other, rehearsing their favorite scenes and dialogue. They do not know that they are playing out an odd Jim Crow symmetry of their black cowboy hero imitating a white cowboy who learned what he knew about cowboying from those original black cowboys, now long lost in time. Sometimes billed as Herbert Jeffrey, he starred in a cluster of low-budget race pictures in the 1930s. Harlem on the Range, Harlem on the Prairie, Rhythm Rodeo, Two-Gun Man from Harlem, The Bronze Buckaroo, and Harlem Rides the Range. So when the day is ending, beneath the setting sun, a happy cowboy's work is fun.
My name is Peter Hershey, and my poem is Batman Umbrella, which is found on page 16. And there are a lot of instances in life that teach you not to take things too seriously, and this poem is based on one of those instances. So I electrocuted myself today, and I guess by that what I'm really trying to say is that today was quite a shock. As I've been taught by scholars and journalists to do, I traced everything back to a gray and black Batman umbrella that I bought when I was 6 years old. It was $10 bought from a store in the mall in preparation for a new school year in the fall. It was to protect me from snow, sleet, rain, snow, sleet, or hail, whatever the weather forecast, the Batman umbrella would prevail. For I walked to school 16 blocks across one road, past 3 Civil War houses and a large playground. I carried my Batman umbrella back and forth from school to home, until finally the day came when it started to rain. Excited, I opened my umbrella large and wide, in plain sight for everyone. All the other elementary school kids, the 2 crossing guards, commuters, and 1 old lady jogger to see. And then suddenly, before it really started to pour, a large gust of wind snapped my umbrella in half, and then it was no more, and I got really wet.
Hi everybody, my name is Ethan Fugate. I'm going to be reading Clamoring. It's on page 54. But first I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I've been doing this for 6 years now, and I've done a lot of readings, and it's just always nice to see people show up and just enjoy it. And also thanks to the editors for setting this up, because I've set up a whole bunch of readings and it's not easy to do. But I want to give you some context to this poem, because to me this is one of the funniest pieces I've ever written, but if you read it alone you wouldn't actually realize it. I wrote this back in 2012, and I was living in Baltimore City at the time, and the Orioles had made the playoffs for the first time since '97. And I've been a huge Orioles fan my whole life. And I had friends that worked down at Camden Yards, and they called me and they said, "Hey man, do you want to go to the game?" I said, yes. And I went out and we go to the game, and I used to drink a lot back then, and I had probably my weight in beer. And the game ends and they win, and the whole city erupts. There's fireworks over downtown, and everybody's just going crazy. And about 5 minutes after the game ended, I realized that I needed to go home because it was getting a little iffy. And so I go back to the bus stop, and it's like 8 blocks walk, and so I'm staggering through the streets, and I get to the bus stop, and the bus is running late because of the game traffic. And I was just standing at the bus stop waiting, and it must have been, to me it felt like 30 minutes, but it was probably only like a minute or 2. And I realized I was probably too drunk to stand up, and I needed to go sit down. So I'm sitting on this bench overlooking the harbor, and all that euphoria from your team winning just goes away, because 2 weeks prior to that, I was living with somebody, and they gave me a real good verbal tongue lashing, and she just said, the way you're living isn't sustainable. You're going to crash and burn. You haven't paid a consequence for any of your actions in over a year. And, I told her she was wrong, because that's what you do in that situation. But on that bench, I realized that she was right. And it took me a long time to actually fully realize that and get my act together. But that's really what this poem is about. It's just that feeling of depression that comes over you when you are completely lost and you have no idea where you're going. And to me, it's just hilarious because of the circumstance it was written under. Just imagine the most arrogant 23-year-old kid you can imagine, so drunk he can't stand up, sitting over and looking over the bay in Baltimore, and just scribbling in a notebook. But I'm going to just go ahead and read it. It's called Clamoring. It takes a bit of magic to watch October baseball and dream of diamonds stuck between asphalt and concrete. I love it though. With fireworks over downtown, I trek onwards, just like Milwaukee 4 years ago. No idea where I'm going, just that my skin is growing old. The worst words to hear uttered are "maybe you were right." I've been saying that a lot lately, over the realization that I was afraid. I still am afraid. I never wanted to yield. I only wanted to strive, to reach much further than the cigarette smoke escaping out of third-story windows, onwards towards heavens of nothingness, where one does what one does, and that is all. Alas, change is my biggest fear. I try to remain stoic about it, but the depression remains, beating through my head like funeral dirges on Water Street, and onwards to the bay as I sit on the bench and taste the polluted Chesapeake Bay cocktail that fills the air. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Michael Osborn, and my story, short narrative, is the shot heard around the block. It's on page 64. This too kind of has a baseball theme. It's a story from, I guess, my youth, and for the young out there, grab these moments because they come and they go pretty quickly. And I have to say that every spring, every time I walk through a grocery store, you know, the section where they sell like toys for kids and everything, you see the plastic ball, the plastic wiffle ball, and I always smile. And this is why. In 1952, Bobby Thompson of Major League Baseball's New York Giants hit what is perhaps the most famous home run in history, the shot heard around the world. With the Giants vying for the pennant against their neighbors, the Brooklyn Dodgers, Thompson hit Dodger pitcher Ralph Branca's delivery over the left field fence in the bottom of the ninth to win the game. The dramatic home run sent the Giants on to the World Series and sent the Dodgers home for the winter. When we were kids, my friends and I dreamed of duplicating the feats of our heroes, like scoring a winning touchdown in the final seconds of a football game or hitting a defining home run at the end of a season to win the pennant. To while away the days of summer vacation, we played baseball with a wiffle ball, a plastic bat, and rules curtailed to fit the limitations of a backyard turned ballpark. The tall oaks on one side and the back of a house on the other served as our stadium, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves was our roar of the crowd. It was a special time, and though we didn't know it then. As our 1981 and final season was coming to a close, we would get our own famous home run. Our shot heard round the block was only for us, and meant more than the end of our season or our wiffle ball days. It sent our childhood home for the winter. Sandalwood Drive down Hillside Place, up Briarwood Drive, and back around to Sandalwood Drive via Briarwood Place was our block, our neighborhood. In the summer of 1979, 12 kids from around the block started a wiffle ball baseball league. One kid equaled one team. He or she was pitcher, infielder, outfielder, and batter. We kept stats and records. It was magical. In the summer of 1980, 8 kids started the season, but only half would play into the fall. As the school year progressed and winter turned to spring, May turned to June, and 80 became 81, the 4 of us who finished the prior season were the lone players. Brian, Kenny, Toby, and I were the only ones around to have the last crack of the plastic mean anything. All of our baseball games were only ever played in 2 backyards. For the entire first season and half of the second, my backyard showed the effects of the steady trampling of growing feet. 2 bare spots in the yard where we pitched and batted packed the dirt and made it as hard as cement. My grandfather thought it was an eyesore and halted play. So like any group of friends looking for fun things to do during summer vacation, we improvised and moved from the cozy confines of my backyard, where homers were hit in abundance, to finish the second season 2 doors down in Toby's backyard. There was, however, a problem. The layout was a little more spacious, and not one of the 4 of us was able to hit a plastic wiffle ball far enough to go over the fence for a home run. In the late summer of 1981, due to planned replanting and construction, Toby's backyard would no longer be available, leaving us nowhere left to play our wiffle ball. We trudged through the season anyway, trying to get in as many games as we could. As a way to alleviate the frustration of the lack of home runs hit in Toby's backyard, we tried other combination types of bats and balls. A tennis ball bends and ruins a plastic bat. A golf ball and a wooden bat we noticed might get the pitcher killed. A tennis ball and an aluminum bat meant we spent more time retrieving the ball than playing. And a regular baseball and wooden bat was too much of a danger to nearby aluminum siding and windows. We always went back to plastic on plastic, as it was becoming a test of manhood. The date of the concrete pouring and the start of construction was fast approaching, and the challenge of hitting that first homer with the plastic ball became all-encompassing. As hard as we tried, it was to no avail. School finally started, and the last day we could play came, and though we'd come close many times that August and September, closer than ever before, no one had yet hit one. We decided on the matchups of our final day of that 81 season. I would play Brian in the first game that day, and Toby would play Kenny in the last. Winning and losing was inconsequential. Hitting a home run, however, was all important. Brian and I played our homerless game and promptly left for my house while Toby and Kenny played theirs. While watching television at my house, Brian and I heard the yelling and screaming. Toby and Kenny ran straight to my house to announce the quest was over. Toby had hit a pitch high, deep, and over his fence for a home run. The four of us celebrating immediately ran to retrieve the ball. There it was, resting in our neighbor's grass, a plastic wiffle ball. We stood over it for a second, and without much fanfare, picked it up and went about our day. The season was over. We were finally getting big enough and strong enough to hit a plastic wiffle ball over a fence. If there had been a 1982 season, there probably would have been plenty of home runs, leaving Toby's homer as only being special to us because it was the first. As it turned out, there was no 1982 season, and it wasn't just the first, it was the only. Our shot heard round the block ended a chapter in our lives. That one and only home run on that final day in that final game allows me to wax nostalgic about the end of our childhood and the onset of winter. Thank you.
Hey, I wrote Hungry, and it's on page 31. The background for this is that in October of this year, I had the privilege to go to Guatemala as part of a medical missions team, and the first time that I went to Guatemala was about 10 years ago, and I realized that every time you go there as a missionary, you can never come back home. The place that you leave, you think is your home, and then you go to this foreign place. But you realize when you come back that there's a piece of you that you left there, and you only get to visit it every once in a while. And so I was blessed to be able to do that. And I guess just the struggle of a missionary is to always feel kind of eternally displaced. And so my hope was in writing this to bring a piece of that place to here. So it's called Hungry. 3,000 miles away from the land of distracted opportunity dwells a hunger that is able to be filled. It beams through the brown eyes of a beautiful people who, through the necessity of poverty, have learned to sever spirit from stomach. Even in the desert heat, well-trenched smile creases are bountifully irrigated with sweat and joyous tears. When within her soul she recognizes a loss of the urgency that accompanies desperate hope, the land and people draw her back to the place of radical dependence on faith alone. There are some places, most near the equator, where a wanderer may come face to face with a body of water and find her truest reflection there. In time she must leave, on the silver wings of man's creation, back to the familiar square of earth that most resembles her temporary home beneath the clouds. As a horizon that by very nature must disappear upon arrival, so is the fleeting security that the infamous American dream is a universal or worthy goal. Each time she returns branded by distrust of the culturally infused tendency to amass wealth as individuals, to climb ladders built for one, to find success upon the shoulders of another rather than alongside them. Just as Oliver Wendell Holmes recognized the brain's inability to return to the same size after having been expanded by a new idea, so her heart took notice that its American clothing could no longer cover the swell of the third world surging inside her veins. Naked, exposed, transparent, she comes hungry to the land of hunger. One of 12 missionaries, a size perfectly suited to those carrying the name of Jesus to a far-off land. Above the moonlit reflection of the nation's capital in the early morning stillness of the Potomac River, they rise above the nation of individualistic pursuit and land as a team in the collectivist nation of Guatemala. Encumbered by the weight of suitcases, overflowing with medications, they can no longer bear the burden of self. As one body, they lift the custom-fit yoke of purpose, immediately yielding comfort and desire in exchange for a glory not their own. Young Elvie stood with bare feet at the gate of the church and waited. He waited in hopeful expectation for a prayer delayed in being answered. As though his bones were fashioned of the cinder blocks he leaned against, he waited. At only 3 feet tall, he carried a resolved faith, not often found even in fully grown men. Sunrise burst through his eyes as the dust from their chicken bus met his longing. With fair skin and golden hair that seemed to allow the sunlight to linger, they disembarked. At 6'4" and 17 years of age, an energetic missionary lifted Elvie from the dirt of the third world and hoisted the young boy upon his shoulders, and there he stayed for the next 8 days, the hunger inside of each of them filled in one another. Medications aligned the concrete altar as the village witnessed the transformation from church to medical clinic, altar to pharmacy, and foreigner to friend. With fragmented recollections of high school Spanish randomly bubbling to the surface, they spoke the universal language of love, most eloquently to those waiting in line through the tender application of glittered nail polish. With gentle strokes of a hairbrush, the children were drawn into the familiarity of loving touch. The illusion of personal space became a distant afterthought in light of the presence of one another. Away from the permeating electronic feedback of the mainland, they resolved with single purpose to truly connect to the people, to the land, and the hunger, to feel all that there is to feel, and allow themselves to be felt by little hands that desire no more than to be held. A hunger demanding of attention was recognized. As the team traveled up the mountain in the back of pickup trucks designed for standing room only, knees buckled beneath the burden of blessing recognized by each of them. To whom much has been given, much will be required, and it was. As the air thinned, so did the provisions. Absolute poverty engulfed each of them, with biting conviction to offer more. Clinics remained open until every woman and child was seen, until every man returned home from his labor, farming corn and cantaloupe on the mountainside. It was a harvest that he would never call his own, working the land belonging to another, his 2-hour morning commute spent navigating steep canyon walls on foot for a single $1. And yet gratitude so permeated the region that after hours of waiting in line for the rare opportunity to receive medical care, no one complained. Not a single fussy child, not a disgruntled mother insistent on informing the staff about how she had been slighted when the pharmacy ran out of vitamins. Mercy abounded, and love consumed the barren land. The harvest was ripe, and the workers were overwhelmed by the concept of amazing grace, previously known only to them in anthem rather than experience. With shining crosses and tarnished faith, they crossed the ocean to serve a people with tarnished crosses and shining faith. A faith planted in seeds of desperation, watching as children rummage through landfills to fight wild dogs in the battle for survival. A seed watered by tears, tears that accompany absolute surrender to the will of a sovereign God. A tender faith, nourished by the light of the sun, that is completely reliant on the heavens to water and preserve crops, and all the people who labor, dwell, and are sustained by them. A thirst for living water that leads the one who tastes the sweetness of her spring to discover rest and peacefulness at her shore. A hunger that is able to be satisfied. A contentedness that does not desire castles built for one, and an entourage of servants to care for the accumulation of possessions stored there. The faith of a people that recognize the value of the wealth that they have in one another. Radiant faith that keeps the spirit full while the stomach remains empty.
My name is Rachel Heinhorst, and my poem is on page 30. My daughter is 9, and she asks the most honest and sincere questions, and I pray for that to continue forever, but I know that it won't. And this poem kind of comes out of something like that, because she was outside doing cartwheels over the summer, and, well, a bee got her on her lip. And I was on the porch swing watching her, and she ran over to me, and she was just starting to feel the pain, that sudden, like she knew something happened, and it was starting to, you could see her eyes water up, and she came over to me, It was starting to get a little swollen. I could see it. And she came over to me and she just burst out crying and said, "Why did the bee do that to me, Mommy?" And so after a little while and later on, I wrote this. The grace of her lips. A bee has stung her on her lip. She comes to me crying and swelling, and she has the cutest lips. I met them 9 years ago when the nurse handed her down for her first feeding, and she latched, and my body trembled, courage and fear, and my mind emptied the room until all I could see was the grace of her lips, and they were moist and shining, and she was sucking hard, and I could move on to look her over, to touch each knuckle of her hand clamping my hospital gown. And when she fell asleep, when a drip of my milk ran from her mouth to find the curve of my breast, I released her and she swallowed and puckered and calmed, and with one finger I circled her lips. And with one finger now I touch where it hurts, and I tell her how this bee didn't know any better, that it must have mistaken her lips for a flower. Thank you.
Okay, one more hand for all the readers tonight. That was great.